One power could be controlled by another woman, a sul'dam, who forced the damani to use her talents for whatever the Shan-Chan wanted, even as a weapon. A damani was no better than an animal, if a well-tended one, and they made damani of every last woman found with the ability to channel or the spark born in her. The Shan-Chan had scoured Toman Head more thoroughly than the tower had ever dreamed of. The mere thought of Idam and sul'dam and damani made Nynaeve's stomach churn. "We know a little," she told Sarandon, "but we want to know more." The Shan-Chan were gone, driven away by Rand, but that was not to say they would not return one day. It was a distant danger beside everything else they had to face, yet just because you had a thorn in your foot did not mean that a briar scratch on your arm would not fester eventually. "You would do well to answer our questions truthfully. There would be time on the journey north." "I promise that nothing will happen to you," Elaine added. "I will protect you, if need be." The pale-haired woman's eyes shifted from one of them to the other, and suddenly, to Nynaeve's amazement, she prostrated herself on the ground in front of Elaine. "You are a high lady of this land, just as you told Luca. I did not realize. Forgive me, high lady. I submit myself to you." And she kissed the ground in front of Elaine's feet. Elaine's eyes looked ready to leap out of her face. Nynaeve was sure she was no better. "Get up," she hissed, looking around frantically to see if anyone was watching. Luca was, curse him, and Latrell, still wearing that scowl, but there was nothing to be done. "Get up!" The woman did not stir. "Stand on your feet, Sarandon," Elaine said. "No one requires people to behave that way in this land, not even a ruler." As Sarandon scrambled erect, she added, "I will teach you the proper way to behave in return for your answers to our questions." The woman bowed, hands on her knees and head down. "Yes, high lady, it will be as you say. I'm yours." Nynaeve sighed heavily. They were going to have a fine time traveling to Gildan. Chapter 18. A Hound of Darkness. Leandrin guided her horse through the crowded streets of Amador, the sneer on her rosebud lips hidden by her deep, curving bonnet. She had hated to give up her multitude of braids, and hated even more the ludicrous fashions of this ludicrous land. The reddish-yellow of hat and riding dress she rather liked, but not the large velvet bows on both. Still, the bonnet hid her eyes. Combined with honey-yellow hair, brown eyes would have named her a Tarabonner in an instant. Not a good thing in Amadisia just now. And it hid what would have been even worse to show here, an Aes Sedai's face. Safely hidden, she could smirk at the white cloaks, who seemed to be every fifth man in the streets. Not that the soldiers who made another fifth would have been any better. None of them ever thought to look inside the bonnet, of course. Aes Sedai were outlawed here, and that meant there were none. Even so, she felt a little better when she turned in at the elaborate iron gates in front of Jorin Areen's house. Another fruitless trip looking for word from the White Tower. There had been nothing since she had learned that Elida thought she was in control of the tower, and that the Shanche woman had been disposed of. Swan had escaped, true, but she was a useless rag now. The gardens behind the gray stone fence were full of plants going rather brown from lack of rain, but trimmed and trained into cubes and balls, though one was shaped like a leaping horse. Only one, of course. Merchants like Areen mimicked their betters, but they dared not go too far lest someone think their conceit too high. Elaborate balconies decorated the large wooden house with its red-tiled roofs, and even a colonnade of carved columns, but unlike the lord's dwelling it was meant to copy, it stood on a stone foundation no more than 10 feet tall. A childish pretense at a noble's manner. The stringy, gray-haired man who scurried out deferentially to hold her stirrup while she dismounted and take her reins was clad all in black. Whatever colors a merchant chose for livery, they were sure to be some real lord's colors, and even a minor lord could cause trouble for the richest seller of goods. People in the streets called black merchant's livery, and snickered when they said it. Leandrin despised the groom's black coat as much as she did Arim's house and Arim himself. She would have true manners one day, palaces. They had been promised to her, and the power that went with them. Stripping off her riding gloves, she stalked up the ridiculous ramp that slanted along the foundations to the vine-carved front doors. The lord's fortress manors had ramps, so of course a merchant who thought well of himself could not have steps. A black-clad young serving girl took gloves and hat in the round entrance hall, with its many doors and carved and brightly painted columns and its encircling balcony. The ceiling was lacquered in imitation of a mosaic, stars within stars in gold and black. "I will have my bath in 1 hour," she told the woman. "It will be the proper temperature this time, yes?" The maid went pale as she curtsied, stammering agreement before scurrying away. Amelia Arim, Joran's wife, came through one of the doors deep in conversation with a fat, balding man in a spotless white apron. Leandrin breathed contemptuously. The woman had pretensions, yet she not only spoke to the cook herself, she brought the man out of his kitchens to discuss meals. She treated the servant like a friend. Fat Evan saw her first and gulped, his piggy eyes darting away immediately. She did not like men looking at her, and she had spoken sharply to him on her first day here about the way his gaze sometimes lingered. He had tried to deny it, but she knew men's vile habits. Without waiting to be dismissed by his mistress, Evan all but ran back the way he had come. The graying merchant's wife had been a stern-faced woman when Leandrin and the others came. Now she licked her lips and smoothed her bow-draped green silk needlessly. "There is someone upstairs with the others, my lady," she said diffidently. She had thought that she could use Leandrin's name that first day. "In the front withdrawing room. From Tarvalon, I believe." Wondering who it could be, Leandrin started for the nearest of the curving staircases. She knew few others of the Black Aja, of course, for safety's sake. What others did not know, they could not betray. In the tower, she had known only one of the 12 who went with her when she left. 2 of the 12 were dead, and she knew at whose feet to lay the blame. Egwene Alvir, Nynaeve Almira, and Elaine Trakand. Everything had gone so badly in Panchico that she would have thought those 3 upstart accepted had been there, except that they were fools who had twice walked tamely into traps she had set. That they had escaped each was of no consequence. Had they been in Chanchico, they would have fallen into her hands, whatever Gianna claimed to have seen. The next time she found them, they would never escape anything again. She would be done with them, whatever her orders. "My lady," Amelia stammered. "My husband, my lady. Joran. Please, will one of you help him? He did not mean it, my lady. He has learned his lesson." Leandrin paused with one hand on the carved banister, looking back over her shoulder. He should not have thought that his oaths to the great lord could be conveniently forgotten, no? "He has learned, my lady. Please. He lies beneath blankets all day, in this heat, shivering. He weeps when anyone touches him or speaks above a whisper." Leandrin paused as if considering, then nodded graciously. "I will ask Chesma to see what she can do. Yet you understand that I make no promises." The woman's unsteady thanks followed her up, but she paid them no mind. Tamila had let herself be carried away. She had been gray Aja before becoming black, and she always made a point of spreading the pain evenly when she mediated. She had been very successful as a mediator, for she liked spreading pain. Chesmal said he might be able to do small tasks in a few months, so long as they were not too hard, and no one raised a voice. She had been one of the best healers in generations among the Yellow, so she should know. The front withdrawing room startled her when she went in. 9 of the 10 black sisters who had come with her stood around the room against the carved and painted paneling, though there were plenty of silk-cushioned chairs on the gold-fringed carpet. The 10th, Tamila Kinderrhoda, was handing a delicate porcelain cup of tea to a dark-haired, sturdily handsome woman in a bronze-colored gown of unfamiliar cut. The seated woman looked vaguely familiar, though she was not Aes Sedai. She was plainly approaching her middle years, and despite smooth cheeks, there was nothing of agelessness about her. Yet the mood made Leandrin cautious. Tamila was deceptively fragile in appearance, with big childlike blue eyes that made people trust her. Those eyes appeared worried now, or uneasy, and the teacup rattled on the saucer before the other woman took it. Every face looked uneasy, except that of the oddly familiar woman. Coppery-skinned Gianna Kaida, in one of those disgusting Domani garments that she wore inside the house, had tears still glistening on her cheeks. She had been a green, and liked flaunting herself in front of men even more than most greens. Rihanna Andomuran, once white and always a coldly arrogant killer, nervously kept touching the pale streak in her black hair above her left ear. Her arrogance had been flattened. "What has happened here?" Leandrin demanded. "Who are you, and what—" Suddenly the memory flashed into her head. A dark friend, a servant in Tanchico who had continually gotten above herself. "Gildin!" she snapped. This servant had followed them in some fashion, and obviously was trying to pass herself off as a black courier with some dire news. "You have overstepped yourself too far this time." She reached to embrace Saidar, yet even as she did, the glow surrounded the other woman, and Leandrin's reach ran into a thick, invisible wall, shutting her away from the source. It hung there like the sun, tantalizingly out of reach. "Stop gaping, Leandrin," the woman said calmly. "You look like a fish. It is not Gildin, but Mogadine. This tea needs more honey, Tamila." The slender, fox-faced woman darted to take the cup, breathing heavily. It had to be so. Who else could have so cowed the others? Leandrin looked at them standing around the walls. Round-faced Eldrith Jondar, for once not looking vague at all despite an ink smudge on her nose, nodded vigorously. The others seemed afraid to twitch. Why one of the Forsaken? They were not supposed to use that name, but usually did among themselves. Why Mogadine would have masqueraded as a servant she could not understand. The woman had, or could have, everything that she herself wanted. Not just knowledge of the one power beyond her dreams, but power. Power over others, power over the world, and immortality. Power for a lifetime that would never end. She and her sisters had speculated on dissension among the Forsaken. There had been orders at odds with each other, and orders given to other dark friends at odds with theirs. Perhaps Mogadine had been hiding from the rest of the Forsaken. Leandrin spread her divided riding skirts as best she could in a deep curtsy. "We welcome you, great mistress. With the chosen to lead us, we shall surely triumph before the day of the great lord's return." "Nicely said," Mogadine said dryly, taking the cup back from Tamila. "Yes, this is much better." Tamila looked absurdly grateful and relieved. What had Mogadine done? Suddenly a thought came to Leandrin, and a welcome one. She had treated one of the chosen as a servant. "Great mistress, in Tanchico I did not know that you—" "Of course you did not," Mogadine said irritably. "What good to bide my time in the shadows if you and these others knew me?" Abruptly a small smile appeared on her lips. It touched nothing else. "Are you worried about those times you sent Gildin to the cook to be beaten?" Sweat beaded suddenly on Leandrin's face. "Do you truly believe I would allow such a thing? The man no doubt reported to you, but he remembered what I wanted him to remember. He actually felt sorry for Gildin, so cruelly treated by her mistress. That seemed to amuse her greatly. He gave me some of the desserts that he made for you. It would not displease me if he still lives." Leandrin drew a relieved breath. She would not die. "Great mistress, there is no need to shield me. I also serve the great lord. I swore my oaths as a dark friend before ever I went to the White Tower. I sought the Black Aja from the day that I knew that I could channel." "So you will be the only one in this ill-ordered pack who does not need to learn who her mistress is?" Mogadine quirked an eyebrow. I would not have thought it of you. The glow around her vanished. I have tasks for you, for all of you. Whatever you have been doing, you will forget. You are an inept lot, as you proved in Tanchico. With my hand on the dog whip, perhaps you will hunt more successfully. We await orders from the tower, great mistress, Leandrin said. Inept? They had almost found what they were hunting for in Tanchico when the city exploded in riots. They had barely escaped destruction at the hands of Aes Sedai, who had somehow wandered into the middle of their plan. Had Mogadine revealed herself, or even taken part on their behalf, they would have triumphed. If their failure was anyone's fault, it was Mogadine's herself. Leandrin reached toward the true source, not to embrace it, but to be certain that the shield had not merely been tied off. It was gone. We have been given great responsibilities, great works to prove, and surely we will be commanded to continue. Mogadine cut her off sharply. You serve whichever of the chosen chooses to snap you up. Whoever sends you orders from the White Tower, she takes her own from one of us now, and very likely grovels on her belly when she does. You will serve me, Leandrin. Be sure of it. Mogadine did not know who headed the Black Ajah. It was a revelation. Mogadine did not know everything. Leandrin had always imagined the Forsaken as close to omnipotent, something far beyond ordinary mortals. Perhaps the woman truly was in flight from the other Forsaken. To hand her over to them would surely earn her a high place. She might even become one of them. She had a trick, learned in childhood, and she could touch the source. Great mistress, we serve the great lord as you do. We also were promised eternal life and power when the great lord Do you think that you are my equal, little sister? Mogadine grimaced in disgust. Did you stand in the pit of doom to dedicate your soul to the great lord? Did you taste the sweetness of victory at Parandaisen, or the bitter ashes at the Aesar dawn? You are a barely trained puppy, not the pack mistress, and you will go where I point until I see fit to give you a better place. These others thought themselves more than they are, too. Do you wish to try your strength against me? Of course not, great mistress. Not when she was forewarned and ready. You will do so sooner or later, and I prefer to put it out of the way now in the beginning. Why do you think your companions look so cheerful? I have taught each of them the same lesson already today. I will not wonder when you must be taught too. I will be done with it now. Try. Licking her lips fearfully, Leandrin looked around at the women standing rigidly against the walls. Only Asmi Zaramine so much as blinked. She shook her head ever so slightly. Asmi's tilted eyes, high cheekbones, and strong nose marked her Saldaean, and she had all the vaunted Saldaean boldness. If she counseled against, if her dark eyes held a tinge of fear, then it was surely best to grovel, however much was needed to make Mogadine relent. And yet there was her trick. She went to her knees, head low, looking up at the Forsaken with a fear that was only partly feigned. Mogadine lounged in her chair, sipping the tea. Great mistress, I beg you to forgive me if I have presumed. I know that I am but a worm beneath your foot. I beg, as one who would be your faithful hound, for your mercy on this wretched dog. Mogadine's eyes dropped to her cup, and in a flash, while the words still tumbled from her mouth, Leandrin embraced the source and channeled, seeking the crack that must be in the Forsaken's confidence, the crack that was in everyone's facade of strength. Even as she lashed out, the light of Saidar surrounded the other woman, and pain enveloped Leandrin. She crumpled to the carpet, trying to howl, but agony beyond anything she had ever known silenced her gaping mouth. Her eyes were going to burst from her head. Her skin was going to peel away in strips. For an eternity she thrashed, and when it vanished as suddenly as it had begun, all she could do was lie there, shuddering and weeping open-mouthed. Do you begin to see? Mogadine said calmly, handing the empty cup to Tamila with, That was very good, but next time a little stronger. Tamila looked as though she might faint. You are not quick enough, Leandrin. You are not strong enough, and you do not know enough. That pitiful little thing you tried against me. Would you like to see what it is really like?" She channeled. Leandrin gazed up at her adoringly. Crawling across the floor, she pushed words through the sobs she still could not stop. "Forgive me, great mistress." This magnificent woman, like a star in the heavens, a comet, above all kings and queens in wonder. "Forgive, please," she begged, pressing kisses against the hem of Mogadin's skirt as she babbled. "Forgive. I am a dog, a worm." It shamed her to her core that she had not meant those things before. They were true. Before this woman, they were all true. "Let me serve you, great mistress. Allow me to serve. Please, please." "I am not Green Dom," Mogadin said, pushing her away roughly with one velvet-slippered foot. Suddenly the sense of worship was gone. Lying there in a heap, weeping, Leandrin could remember. She stared at the Forsaken in horror. "Are you convinced yet, Leandrin?" "Yes, great mistress," she managed. She was. Convinced that she dared not even think of trying again until she was certain of success. Her trick was only the palest shadow of what Mogadin had done. Could she but learn that? "We shall see. I think you may be one of those who needs a second lesson. Pray it is not so, Leandrin. I make second lessons exceedingly sharp. Now take your place with the others. You will find that I have taken some of the objects of power that you had in your room, but you may keep the trinkets that remain. Am I not kind?" "The great mistress is kind," Leandrin agreed, around hiccups and occasional sobs that she could not stifle. Limply she staggered to her feet and went to stand beside Asne. The wall panel against her back helped to hold her upright. She saw the flows of air being woven. Only air, but she still flinched as they bound her mouth shut and stopped sound from her ears. She certainly did not try to resist. She did not even let herself think of Saidar. Who knew what one of the Forsaken could do? Perhaps read her thoughts. That almost made her run. No. If Mogadin knew her thoughts, she would be dead by now, or still screaming on the floor, or kissing Mogadin's feet and begging to serve. Leandrin shivered uncontrollably. If that weave had not bound her mouth, her teeth would have been chattering. Mogadin wove the same around all of them, save Rihanna, whom the Forsaken beckoned with an imperious finger to kneel before her. Then Rihanna left, and Marilyn Gamalfin was unbound and summoned. From where she stood, Leandrin could see their faces, even if their mouths moved soundlessly for her. Plainly each woman was receiving orders the others knew nothing of. The faces told little, though. Rihanna merely listened, a touch of relief in her eyes, bowed her head in assent, and went. Marilyn looked surprised and then eager, but she had been a Brown, and Browns could be enthusiastic over anything that allowed them a chance to unearth some moldy bit of lost knowledge. Gianna Kaida donned a slow mask of horror, shaking her head at first and trying to cover herself in that disgustingly sheer gown, but Mogadin's face hardened, and Gianna nodded hurriedly and fled, if not as eagerly as Marilyn, just as quickly. Barilla Naran, lean almost to scrawniness and as fine a manipulator and plotter as there was, and Phalian Boda, long-faced and cold despite her obvious fear, showed as little expression as Rihanna had. Ispan Shafar, like Leandrin from Tarabon, though dark-haired, actually kissed Mogadin's hem before she rose. Then the flows were unwoven around Leandrin. She thought that it was her turn to be sent away on the shadow knew what errand, until she saw the bonds dispelled around the others remaining as well. Mogadin's finger beckoned peremptorily, and Leandrin knelt between Asne and Chesmal Emry, a tall, handsome woman, dark-haired and dark-eyed. Chesmal, once yellow, could heal or kill with equal ease, but the intensity of her gaze on Mogadin, the way her hands trembled as they clutched her skirts, said she intended only to obey. She would have to go by such signs, Leandrin realized, approaching one of the others with her belief that rewards could be had for handing Mogadin to the rest of the Forsaken might well be disastrous if the one she spoke to had decided that it was in her best interests to be Moghedin's lapdog. She almost whimpered at the thought of a second lesson. "You I keep with me," the Forsaken said, "for the most important task. What the others do may bear sweet fruit, but to me yours will be the most important harvest, a personal harvest. There is a woman named Nynaeve Almira." Leandrin's head came up. Moghedin's dark eyes sharpened. "You know of her?" "I despise her," Leandrin replied truthfully. "She is a filthy wilder who ought never to have been allowed in the tower." She loathed all wilders. Dreaming of being Black Aja, she herself had begun learning to channel a full year before going to the tower, but she was in no way a wilder. "Very good. You 5 are going to find her for me. I want her alive. Oh yes, I do want her alive." Moghedin's smile made Leandrin shiver. Giving Nynaeve and the other 2 to her might be entirely suitable. The day before yesterday, she was in a village called Sienda, perhaps 60 miles east of here, with another young woman in whom I may be interested, but they have vanished. You will... Leandrin listened eagerly. For this she could be a faithful hound. For the other, she would wait patiently. Chapter 19. Memories. My queen. Morghese looked up from the book on her lap. Sunlight slanted through the window of the sitting room next to her bedchamber. The day was already hot, with no breeze, and sweat dampened her face. It would be noon before much longer, and she had not stirred from the room. That was unlike her. She could not remember why she had decided to laze the morning away with a book. She seemed unable to concentrate on reading of late. By the golden clock on the mantel above the marble fireplace, an hour had passed since she last turned a page, and she could not recall its words. It must be the heat. The red-coated young officer of her guards, kneeling with one fist pressed to the red and gold carpet, looked vaguely familiar. Once she had known the name of every guard assigned to the palace. Perhaps it was all the new faces. "Talonvor," she said, surprising herself. He was a tall, well-made young man, but she could not tell why she remembered him in particular. Had he brought someone to her once, long ago? Guardsman Lieutenant Martin Talonvor. He glanced at her, startlingly rough-eyed, before putting his gaze back on the carpet. "My queen, forgive me, but I am surprised that you remain here, given the morning's news." "What news?" It would be good to learn something besides Altema's gossip at the Byron court. At times she felt that there was something else she wanted to ask the woman, but all they ever did was gossip, which she could never remember doing before. Gabriel seemed to enjoy listening to them, sitting in that tall chair in front of the fireplace with his ankles crossed, smiling contentedly. Altema had taken to wearing rather daring dresses. Morghese would have to say something to her. Dimly she seemed to remember thinking that before. Nonsense. If I had, I would have spoken to her already. She shook her head, realizing that she had drifted away from the young officer entirely, that he had begun speaking and stopped when he saw she was not listening. "Tell me again. I was distracted. And stand." He rose, face angry, eyes burning on her before they dropped again. She looked where he had been staring and blushed. Her dress was cut extremely low, but Gabriel liked her to wear them so. With that thought, she ceased fretting about being nearly naked in front of one of her officers. "Be brief," she said curtly. "How dare he look at me in that manner? I should have him flogged. What news is so important that you think you can walk into my sitting room as if it were a tavern?" His face darkened, but whether from proper embarrassment or increased anger she could not say. How dare he be angry with his queen? Does the man think all I have to do is listen to him? "Rebellion, my queen," he said in a flat tone, and all thought of anger and stares vanished. "Where?" "The 2 rivers, my queen. Someone has raised the old banner of Manetheren, the Red Eagle. A messenger came from Whitebridge this morning." Morghese drummed her fingers on the book, her thoughts coming more clearly than it seemed they had in a very long time. Something about the 2 rivers, Some spark she could not quite fan to life tugged at her. The region was hardly part of Andor at all, and had not been for generations. She and the last 3 queens before her had been hard-pressed to maintain a modicum of control over the miners and smelters in the Mountains of Mist, and even that modicum would have been lost had there been any way to get the metals out, save through the rest of Andor. A choice between holding the mine's gold and iron and other metals and keeping the 2 rivers' wool and tabak had not been difficult. But rebellion unchecked, even rebellion in a part of her realm that she ruled only on a map, could spread like wildfire to places that were hers in fact. And Manetheren, destroyed in the Trolloc Wars, Manetheren of legend and story, still had a hold on some men's minds. Besides, the 2 rivers was hers. If they had been left to go their own way for far too long, they were still a part of her realm. Has Lord Gabriel been informed? Of course he had not. He would have come to her with the news and suggestions on how to deal with it. His suggestions were always clearly right. Suggestions? Somehow it seemed that she could remember him telling her what to do. That was impossible, of course. He has, my queen. Talonbor's voice was still bland, unlike his face, where slow anger yet smoldered. He laughed. He said the 2 rivers seemed to throw up trouble, and he would have to do something about it one day. He said this minor annoyance would have to wait its turn behind more important matters. The book fell as she sprang to her feet, and she thought Talonbor smiled in grim satisfaction as she swept by him. A serving woman told her where Gabriel was to be found, and she marched straight to the colonnaded court with its marble fountain, the basin full of lily pads and fish. It was cooler there and shaded a little. Gabriel sat on the broad white coping of the fountain. Lords and ladies gathered around him. She recognized fewer than half. Dark, square-faced Jared of House Sarand and his shrewish, honey-haired wife, Elenia. That simpering Aramilla of House Marn, melting brown eyes always so wide in feigned interest, and bony goat-faced Massin of House Karen, who would tumble any woman he could corner despite his thin white hair. Nayan of House Aron, as usual with a sneer marring her pale beauty, and Lear of House Barin, a whip of a man, wearing a sword of all things, and Karind of House Anshar, with the same flat-eyed stare that some said had put 3 husbands under the ground. The others she did not know at all, which was strange enough, but these she never allowed into the palace, except on state occasions. Every one had opposed her during the succession. Elenia and Nayan had wanted the Lion Throne for themselves. What could Gabriel be thinking to actually bring them here? The size of our estates in Kyrian, my lord, Aramilla was saying, leaning over Gabriel as more gaze approached. None of them more than glanced at her, as if she were a servant with the wine. I want to speak with you concerning the 2 rivers, Gabriel, in private. It has been dealt with, my dear, he said idly, dabbling his fingers in the water. Other matters concern me now. I thought you were going to read during the heat of the day. You should return to your room until the evening's coolness, such as it is. My dear. He had called her my dear in front of these interlopers. As much as she thrilled to hear that on his lips when they were alone. Elenia was hiding her mouth. I think not, Lord Gabriel, Morghese said coldly. You will come with me now, and these others will be out of the palace before I return, or I will exile them from Camelin completely. Suddenly he was on his feet, a big man, towering over her. She seemed unable to look at anything but his dark eyes. Her skin tingled as if an icy wind were blowing through the courtyard. You will go and wait for me, Morghese. His voice was a distant roar, filling her ears. I have dealt with all that needs dealing with. I will come to you this evening. You will go now. You will go. She had one hand lifted to open the door of her sitting room before she realized where she was and what had happened. He had told her to go, and she had gone. Staring at the door in horror, she could see the smirks on the men's faces, open laughter on some of the women's. What has happened to me? How could I become so besotted with any man? She still felt the urge to enter and wait for him. Dazed, she forced herself to turn and walk away. It was an effort. Inside, she cringed at the idea of Gabriel's disappointment in her when he did not find her where he expected, and cringed further at recognizing the fawning thought. At first, she had no notion of where she was going or why, only that she would not wait obediently, not for Gabriel, not for any man or woman in the world. The fountained courtyard kept repeating in her head, him telling her to go, and those hateful, amused faces watching. Her mind still seemed fogged. She could not comprehend how or why she could have let it happen. She had to think of something that she could understand, something she could deal with. Jared Sarand and the others. When she assumed the throne, she had pardoned them for everything they had done during the succession, as she had pardoned everyone who opposed her. It had seemed best to bury all animosities before they could fester into the sort of plotting and scheming that infected so many lands. The game of houses, it was called, Desdemar, or the Great Game, and it led to endless tangled feuds between houses, to the toppling of rulers. The game was at the heart of the civil war in Cairhien, and no doubt had done its part in the turmoil enveloping Aradoman and Tarabon. The pardons had had to go to all to stop Desdemar being born in Andor, but could she have left any unsigned, they would have been the parchments with those sevens' names. Gabriel knew that. Publicly, she had shown no disfavor, but in private she had been willing to speak of her distrust. They had had to pry their jaws open to swear fealty, and she could hear the lie on their tongues. Any one would leap at a chance to pull her down, and all seven together. There was only one conclusion she could reach. Gabriel must be plotting against her. It could not be to put Elenia or Nain on the throne. Not when he has me already, she thought bitterly, behaving like his lapdog. He must mean to supplant her himself, to become the first king that Andor had ever had. And she still felt the desire to return to her book and wait for him. She still ached for his touch. It was not until she saw the aged faces in the hallway around her, the creased cheeks and often bent backs, that she became aware of where she was. The pensioners' quarters. Some servants returned to their families when they grew old, but others had been so long in the palace that they could think of no other life. Here they had their own small apartments, their own shaded garden, and a spacious courtyard. Like every queen before her, she supplemented their pensions by letting them buy food through the palace kitchens for less than its cost, and the infirmary treated their ills. Creaky bows and unsteady curtsies followed her, and murmurs of, "The light shine upon you, my queen," and "The light bless you, my queen," and "The light protect you, my queen." She acknowledged them absently. She knew where she was going now. Lini's door was like all the others along the green tiled corridor, unadorned save for a carving of the rearing lion of Andor. She never thought of knocking before entering. She was the queen, and this was her palace. Her old nurse was not there, though a tea kettle steaming over a small fire in the brick fireplace said she would not be long. The two snug rooms were neatly furnished, the bed made to perfection, the two chairs precisely aligned at the table, where a blue vase in the exact center held a small fan of greenery. Lini had always been a great one for neatness. Morghese was willing to wager that within the wardrobe in the bedchamber, every dress was arranged just so with every other, and the same for pots in the cupboard beside the fireplace in the other room. 6 painted ivory miniatures in small wooden stands made a line on the mantelpiece. How Lini could have afforded them on a nurse's stipend was more than Morghese had ever been able to imagine. She could not ask such a question, of course. In pairs they showed 3 young women, and the same 3 as babes. Elaine was there, and herself. Taking down the portrait of herself at 14, a slender filly of a girl, she could not believe that she had ever looked so innocent. She had worn that ivory silk dress the day she had gone to the White Tower, never dreaming at the time that she would be queen, only harboring the vain hope that she might become Aes Sedai. Absent-mindedly she thumbed the great serpent ring on her left hand. She had not earned that precisely. Women who could not channel were not awarded the ring. But short of her 16th name day, she had returned to contest the Rose Crown in the name of House Trakand, and when she won the throne nearly 2 years later, the ring had been presented to her. By tradition, the daughter heir of Andor always trained in the tower, and in recognition of Andor's long support of the tower, was given the ring, whether or not she could channel. She had only been the heir to House Trakand in the tower, but they gave it to her anyway, once the Rose Crown was on her head. Replacing her own portrait, she took down her mother's, taken at perhaps 2 years older. Lini had been nurse to 3 generations of Trakand women. Maegdin Trakand had been beautiful. Morghese could remember that smile when it had become a mother's loving beam. It was Maegdin who should have had the Lion Throne, but a fever had carried her away, and a young girl had found herself high seat of House Trakand, in the middle of a struggle for the throne, with no more support in the beginning than her house retainers and the house bard. I won the Lion Throne. I will not give it up, and I will not see a man take it. For 1,000 years a queen has ruled Andor, and I will not let that end now. Meddling in my things again, are you, child? That voice triggered long-forgotten reflexes. Morghese had the miniature hidden behind her back before she knew it. With a rueful shake of her head, she put the portrait back on its stand. I am not a girl in the nursery any longer, Lini. You must remember that, or one day you will say something where I must do something about it. My neck is scrawny and old, Lini said, setting a net bag of carrots and turnips on the table. She looked frail in her neat gray dress, her white hair drawn back in a bun from a narrow face with skin like thin parchment. But her back was straight, her voice clear and steady, and her dark eyes as sharp as ever. If you want to give it to a hangman or headsman, I am almost done with it anyway. A gnarled old branch dulls the blade that severs a sapling. Morghese sighed. Lini would never change. She would not curtsy if the entire court were watching. You do grow tougher as you grow older. I am not certain a headsman could find an axe sharp enough for your neck. You've not been to see me in some time, so I suppose there's something you need to work out in your mind. When you were in the nursery and later, you always used to come to me when you couldn't work matters out. Shall I make a pot of tea? Some time, Lini? I visit you every week, and a wonder I do, given how you speak to me. I would exile the highest lady in Andor if she said half what you do. Lini gave her a level look. You have not darkened my doorway since the spring, and I talk as I always have. I'm too old to change now. Do you want tea? No. Morghese put a hand to her head in confusion. She did visit Lini every week. She could remember. She could not remember. Gabriel had filled her hours so completely that sometimes it was hard to remember anything other than him. No, I do not want tea. I do not know why I came. You cannot help me with the problem I have. Her old nurse snorted, though somehow she made it a delicate sound. Your trouble is with Gabriel, isn't it? Only now you're ashamed to tell me. Girl, I changed you in your cradle, tended you when you were sick and heaving your stomach up, and told you what you needed to know about men. You've never been too shamed to discuss anything with me, and now is no time to begin. Gabriel? Morghese's eyes widened. You know? But how? Oh, child, Lini said sadly. Everyone knows, though no one's had the courage to tell you. I might have if you hadn't stayed away, but it is hardly something I could go running to you with, now is it? It is the kind of thing a woman won't believe until she finds out for herself. What are you talking about? Morghese demanded. It was your duty to come to me if you knew, Lini. It was everyone's duty. Light, I am the last to know, and now it may be too late to stop it. Too late? Lini said incredulously. Why should it be too late? You Bundle Gabriel out of the palace, out of Andor, and Altema and the others with him, and it is done with. Too late indeed. For a moment, Morghese could not speak. Altema? She said finally. And the others? Linny stared at her, then shook her head in disgust. I am an old fool. My wits are dry-rooted. Well, you know now. When the honey's out of the comb, there's no putting it back. Her voice became gentler, and at the same time brisk, the voice she had used for telling Morghese that her pony had broken a leg and had to be put down. Gabriel spends most of his nights with you, but Altema has nearly as much of his time. He spreads himself thin with the other 6. 5 have rooms in the palace. 1, a big-eyed young thing, he sneaks in and out for some reason, all swathed in a cloak, even in this heat. Perhaps she has a husband. I'm sorry, girl, but truth is truth. Better to face the bear than run from it. Morghese's knees sagged, and if Lini had not hurriedly pulled the chair from the table to shove under her, she would have sat down on the floor. Altema. Him watching the two of them as they gossiped took on a new image now. A man fondly watching 2 of his pet cats at play. And 6 others. Rage boiled up in her, a rage that had been lacking when she only thought he was after her throne. That she had considered coldly, clearly, as clearly as she could consider anything recently. That was a danger that had to be looked at with cold reason. But this! The man had ensconced his jades in her palace. He had made her just another of his trolls. She wanted his head. She wanted him flayed alive. The light helper, she wanted his touch. I must be going mad. That will be solved along with everything else, she said coldly. Much depended on who was in Camelin, and who on their country estates. Where is Lord Pelivar, Lord Abel, Lady Arathel? They led strong houses, and many retainers. Exiled, Linny said slowly, giving her an odd. You exiled them from the city last spring. Morghese stared back. She remembered none of that, except that now, dim and distant, she did. Lady Elorian, she said slowly. Lady Aemlyn and Lord Luan? More strong houses, more houses that had been behind her before she gained the throne. Exile, Linny replied just as slowly. You had Elorian flogged for demanding to know why. She bent to brush Morghese's hair back, gnarled fingers lingering on her cheek as they had when she checked for fever. Are you well, girl? Morghese nodded dully, but it was because she was remembering, in a shadowy way. Elorian, screaming in outrage as her gown was ripped down the back. House Tremaine had been the very first to throw its support to Tricond, brought by a plumply pretty woman only a few years older than Morghese. Brought by Elorian, now one of her closest friends. At least she had been. Elaine had been named after Elorian's grandmother. Vaguely she could recall others leaving the city, distancing themselves from her, it seemed obvious now. And those who remained? Houses too weak to be of any use, or else sycophants. She seemed to recall signing numerous documents Gabriel had laid in front of her, creating new titles. Gabriel's Toad Eaters and her enemies. They were all she could count on being strong in Camelin. I do not care what you say, Lini said firmly. You have no fever, but there's something wrong. You need an Aes Sedai healer is what you need. No Aes Sedai. Morghese's voice was even harder. She fingered her ring again, briefly. She knew that her animosity toward the tower had grown recently beyond what some might say was reasonable, yet she could no longer make herself trust a white tower that seemed to be trying to hide her daughter from her. Her letter to the new Amerlin demanding Elaine's return. No one demanded anything of an Amerlin seat, but she had. That letter was yet unanswered. It had barely had time to reach Tar Valon. In any case, she knew for cold fact that she would not have an Aes Sedai near her, and yet, right alongside that, she could not think of Elaine without a swell of pride. Raised accepted after so short a time. Elaine might well be the first woman to sit on the throne of Andor as full Aes Sedai, not just tower-trained. It made no sense that she could feel both things at once, but very little made any sense just now, and her daughter would never have the Lion Throne if Morghese did not secure it for her. I said no Aes Sedai, Lini, so you might as well stop looking at me like that. This is one time you will not make me take bad-tasting medicine. Besides which, I doubt if there is an Aes Sedai of any stripe to be found in Camelin. Her old supporters gone, exiled by her own signature, and maybe her enemies for good over what she had done to Elorian. New lords and ladies in their places in the palace, new faces in the guards. What loyalty remained there? Would you recognize a guardsman lieutenant named Talanvor, Lini? At the other woman's quick nod, she went on. Find him for me and bring him here. But do not let him know you are bringing him to me. In fact, tell everyone in the pensioners' quarters that should anyone ask, I am not here. There is more to this than Gabriel and his women, isn't there? Just go, Lini, and hurry. There is not much time. By the shadows she could see in the tree-filled garden through the window, the sun had passed its height. Evening would be there all too soon. Evening, when Gabriel would be looking for her. When Lini left, Morghese remained in the chair, sitting rigidly. She dared not stand. Her knees were stronger now, but she feared that if she began moving, she would not stop until she was back in her sitting room, waiting for Gabriel. The urge was that strong, especially now that she was alone. And once he looked at her, once he touched her, she had no doubt that she would forgive him everything. Forget everything, maybe, based on how fuzzy and incomplete her memories were. Had she not known better, she could have thought that he had used the one power on her in some way, but no man who could channel survived to his age. Lini had often told her that there was always one man in the world for whom a woman would find herself behaving a brainless fool, but she had never believed that she could succumb. Still, her choices in men had never been good, however right they seemed at the time. Tarangale Damodred she had wed for political reasons. He had been married to Tigraine, the daughter-heir whose disappearance had set off the succession when Mordralane died. Marrying him had made a link with the old queen, smoothing the doubts of most of her opponents, and, more importantly, had maintained the alliance that had ended the ceaseless wars with Cairhien. In such ways did queens choose their husbands. Tarangale had been a cold, distant man, and there was never love, despite 2 wonderful children. It had been almost a relief when he died in a hunting accident. Tom Drill Marilyn, house bard and then court bard, had been a joy at first, intelligent and witty, a laughing man who used the tricks of the game of houses to aid her to the throne, and help strengthen Andor once she had it. He had been twice her age then, yet she might have married him. Marriages with commoners were not unheard of in Andor, but he vanished without a word, and her temper got the better of her. She never had learned why he had gone, but it did not matter. When he finally returned, she would surely have rescinded the arrest order, but for once, instead of softly turning her anger aside, he had met her harsh word for harsh word, saying things she could never forgive. Her ears still burned to remember being called a spoiled child and a puppet of Tar Valon. He had actually shaken her, his queen. Then there had been Gareth Bryn, strong and capable, as bluff as his face and as stubborn as she. He had turned out to be a treasonous fool. He was well out of her life. It seemed years since she had seen him instead of little more than half of one. And finally, Gabriel, the crown to her list of bad choices. At least the others had not tried to supplant her. Not so many men for one woman's life, but in another way, too many. Another thing that Lini sometimes said was that men were only good for 3 things, though very good for those. She had been on the throne before Lini had thought her old enough to tell what the 3 things were. Perhaps if I'd kept just to the dancing, she thought wryly, I'd not have so much trouble with them. The shadows in the garden beyond the window had shifted an hour's worth before Lini returned with young Talonvor, who went to one knee while she was still shutting the door. "He didn't want to come with me at first," she said. 50 years ago, I suppose I could have shown what you are displaying to the world, and he'd have followed quick enough. But now I must needs use sweet reason." Talonvor turned his head to look up at her sourly. "You threatened to harry me here with a stick if I did not come. You are lucky I wondered what was so important to you, instead of having somebody drag you to the infirmary." Her stern sniff did not faze him. His acrid gaze turned angry as it shifted to Morgaze. "I see your meeting with Gabriel did not go well, my queen. I had hoped for more." He was looking straight at her eyes, but Lini's comment had made her aware of her dress again. She felt as though glowing arrows were pointing to her exposed bosom. It was an effort to keep her hands calmly in her lap. "You are a sharp lad, Talonvor, and loyal, I believe, else you would not have come to me with the news of the 2 rivers. "I'm not a boy," he snapped, jerking upright where he knelt. "I am a man who has sworn his life in service to his queen." She let her temper flare right back at him. "If you are a man, behave as one. Stand and answer your queen's questions truthfully. And remember that I am your queen, young Talonvor. Whatever you think may have happened, I am Queen of Andor." "Forgive me, my queen, I hear and obey." The words were properly said, if not exactly contrite, but he stood head high, staring at her as defiantly as ever. Light! The man was as stubborn as Gareth Bryn had ever been. "How many loyal men are there among the guards in the palace? How many will obey their oaths and follow me?" "I will," he said quietly, and suddenly all of his anger was gone, though he still stared intently at her face. "For the rest, if you wish to find loyal men, you must look to the outlying garrisons, perhaps as far as Whitebridge. Some who were in Camelin were sent to Cairhien with the levies, but the rest in the city are Gabriel's to a man. Their new oath is to throne and law, not the queen." It was worse than she had hoped for, but no more than she had expected, really. Whatever he was, Gabriel was no fool. "Then I must go elsewhere to begin re-establishing my rule. The houses would be difficult to rally after the exiles, after Alorian, but it had to be done. Gabriel may try to stop me leaving the palace." She found a faint memory of trying to leave, twice, and being halted by Gabriel. "So you will procure 2 horses and wait in the street behind the south stables. I will meet you there, dressed for riding." "Too public," he said, "and too close. Gabriel's men might recognize you, however you disguised yourself. I know a man. Could you find an inn called the Queen's Blessing in the western part of the new city?" The new city was new only in comparison with the inner city it surrounded. "I can." She did not like being opposed, even when it made sense. Bryn had done that too. It would be a pleasure to show this young man just how well she could disguise herself. It was her habit once a year, though she realized that she had not done it so far this year, to dress as a commoner and walk the streets to feel the pulse of the people. No one had ever recognized her. "But can this man be trusted, young Talonvor?" "Basil Gill is as loyal to you as I am myself." He hesitated, anguish crossing his face, then being replaced by anger once more. "Why have you waited so long? You must have known. You must have seen. Yet you have waited while Gabriel tightened his hands around Andor's neck. Why have you waited?" So, his anger was honestly come by, and it deserved an honest answer. Only she had no answer, certainly not one she could tell him. "It is not your place to question your queen, young man," she said with a gentle firmness. "A loyal man, as I know that you are loyal, serves without question." He let out a long breath. "I will await you in the stable of the Queen's Blessing, my queen." And with a bow suitable for a state audience, he was gone. "Why do you keep calling him young?" Lini demanded once the door closed. It puts his back up. A fool puts a burr under the saddle before she rides. He is young, Linny. Young enough to be my son. Linny snorted, and this time there was nothing delicate about it. He has a few years on Galad, and Galad is too old to be yours. You were playing with dolls when Talanvor was born, and thinking babes came the same way as dolls. Sighing, Morghese wondered if the woman had treated her mother like this. Probably. And if Linny lived long enough to see Elaine on the throne, which somehow she did not doubt, Linny would last forever, she would probably treat Elaine no differently. That was assuming that a throne remained for Elaine to inherit. The question is he as loyal as he seems, Linny? One faithful guardsman, when every other loyal man in the palace has been sent away. Suddenly it seems too good to be true. He swore the new oath. Morghese opened her mouth, but Linny forestalled her. I saw him afterwards, alone behind the stables. That's how I knew who you meant. I found out his name. He did not see me. He was on his knees, tears streaming down his face. He alternated apologizing to you and repeating the old oath, not just to the Queen of Andor, but to Queen Morghese of Andor. He swore in the old way on his sword, slicing his arm to show he would shed his last drop before breaking it. I know a thing or two of men, girl. That one will follow you against an army with nothing but his bare hands. That was good to know. If she could not trust him, she would have to doubt Linny next. No, never Linny. He had sworn in the old way? That was something for stories now. And she was letting her thoughts drift again. Surely Gabriel's clouding of her mind was finished now, with all she knew. Then why did a part of her still want to go back to her sitting room and wait? She had to concentrate. I will need a simple dress, Linny. One that does not fit too well. A little soot from the fireplace, and... Linny insisted on coming, too. Morghese would have had to tie her to a chair to leave her behind, and she was not certain that the old woman would have let herself be tied. She'd always seemed frail, and had always been far stronger than she seemed. When they slipped out through a small side gate, Morghese did not look very much like herself. A bit of soot had darkened her red-gold hair, taken its sheen away and made it lank. Sweat rolling down her face helped as well. No one believed that queens sweated. A shapeless dress of rough, very rough, gray wool with divided skirts completed her disguise. Even her shift and stockings were coarse wool. She looked a farm woman who had ridden the cart horse to market and now wanted to see a little of the city. Linny looked herself, straight-backed and no-nonsense, in a green woolen riding dress, well cut but 10 years out of fashion. Wishing she could scratch, Morghese also wished that the other woman had not taken her so to heart about the dress not fitting very well. Stuffing the low-necked gown away under the bed, her old nurse had muttered some saying about displaying wares you did not mean to sell, and when Morghese claimed she had just made it up, her reply was, "At my age, if I make it up, it's still an old saying." Morghese more than half suspected that her itchy, ill-draped dress was punishment for that gown. The inner city was built on hills, streets following the natural curve of the land and planned to give sudden views of parks full of trees and monuments, or tile-covered towers glittering 100 colors in the sun. Sudden rises hurled the eye across Camelin entire to the rolling plains and forests beyond. Morghese saw none of it as she hurried through the crowds thronging the streets. Usually she would have tried to listen to the people, to gauge their mood. This time she heard only the hum and babble of a great city. She had no thought of trying to rouse them. Thousands of men armed mainly with stones and rage could overwhelm the guards in the royal palace, but if she had not known it before, the riots in the spring that had brought Gabriel to her attention, and the near riots the year before, had shown what mobs could do. She meant to rule again in Camelin, not see it burned. Beyond the white walls of the inner city, the new city had its own beauties. Tall, slender towers and domes gleaming white and gold, huge expanses of red-tiled roofs, and the great towered outer walls, pale gray streaked with silver and white. Broad boulevards, split down the middle by wide expanses of trees and grass, were jammed with people and carriages and wagons. Except to notice in passing that the grass was dying for lack of rain, Morgase kept her mind on what she was hunting. From the experience of her annual forays, she chose the people she questioned carefully. Men, mostly. She knew how she looked, even with soot in her hair, and some women would give wrong directions from jealousy. Men, on the other hand, racked their brains to be right to impress her. None with too smug a face or too rough. The first were often offended at being approached, as though they were not afoot themselves, and the others were likely to think a woman asking directions had something else on her mind. One fellow with a chin too big for his face, hawking a tray of pins and needles, grinned at her and said, "Did anyone ever tell you you look a mite like the Queen? Whatever mess she's made of us, she's a pretty one." She gave him a raucous laugh that earned a stern look from Linny. "You save your flattery for your wife. The second turn to the left, you say? I thank you. And for the compliment, too." As she pushed on through the crowd, a frown settled on her face. She had heard too much of that. Not that she looked like the Queen, but that Morgase had made a mess of things. Gabriel had raised taxes heavily to pay for his levies, it seemed, but she took the blame, and rightly so. The responsibility was the Queen's. Other laws had come out of the palace as well, laws that made little sense but did make people's lives more difficult. She heard whispers about herself, that maybe Andor had had queens long enough. Only murmurs, but what one man dared speak in a low voice, 10 thought. Perhaps it would not have been as easy as she had thought to rouse mobs against Gabriel. Eventually she found her goal, a broad stone inn, the sign over the door bearing a man kneeling before a golden-haired woman in the rose crown, one of her hands on his head, the Queen's blessing. If it was meant to be her, it was not a good likeness. The cheeks were too fat. Not until she stopped in front of the inn did she realize that Leni was puffing. She had set a quick pace, and the woman was far from young. "Leni, I am sorry. I should not have walked so—" "If I can't keep up with you, girl, how will I be able to tend Elaine's babes? Do you mean to stand there? Dragging feet never finish a journey. He said he would be in the stable." The white-haired woman stalked off, muttering to herself, and Morgase followed her around the inn. Before stepping into the stone stable, she shaded her eyes to look at the sun. No more than 2 hours until dusk. Gabriel would be looking by then if he was not already. Talonvor was not alone in the stall-lined stable. When he went to one knee on the straw-covered floor in a green wool coat with his sword belted over it, 2 men and a woman knelt with him, if a bit hesitantly, unsure of her as she was. The stout man, pink-faced and balding, must be Basil Gill, the innkeeper. An old leather jerkin studded with steel discs strained around his girth, and he wore a sword at his hip, too. "My Queen," Gill said, "I've not carried a sword in years, not since the Aiel War. But I'd count it an honor if you allowed me to follow you." He should have looked ridiculous, but he did not. Morgase studied the other 2, a hulking fellow in a rough gray coat, with heavy-lidded eyes, an oft-broken nose, and scars on his face, and a short, pretty woman approaching her middle years. She seemed to be with the street tough, but her high-necked blue wool dress appeared too finely woven for one like him to have bought. The fellow sensed her doubts for all his lazy-eyed appearance. "I am Lamgwin, my Queen, and a good Queen's man. 'Tisn't right what's been done, and it has to be put straight. I want to follow you, too. Me and Brianna both." "Rise," she told them. "It may be some days yet before it is safe for you to acknowledge me as your Queen. I will be glad of your company, Master Gill, and yours, Master Lamgwin, but it will be safer for your woman if she remains in Camelin. There are hard days ahead." Brushing straw from her skirts, Brianna gave her a sharp look, and Leni a sharper. "I have known hard days," she said in a Kyrianan accent. Nobly born, unless Morgaze missed her guess, one of the refugees. And I never knew a good man until I found Lamgwin, or until he found me. The loyalty and love he bears for you, I bear for him tenfold. He follows you, but I follow him. I will not stay behind." Morgaze drew breath, then nodded her acceptance. The woman seemed to take it for granted in any case. A fine seed for the army to retake her throne. One young soldier who scowled at her as often as not. A balding innkeeper who looked as if he had not been on a horse in 20 years. A street tough who appeared more than half asleep. And a refugee Kyrian noblewoman who had made it clear that her loyalties went only as far as the tough. And Linny, of course. Linny, who treated her as though she were still in the nursery. Oh yes, a very fine seed. "Where do we go, my queen?" Gil asked as he began leading already saddled horses out of their stalls. Lamgwin moved with surprising speed to throw another high-cantled saddle on a horse for Linny. Morgaze realized that she had not considered that. Light, Gabriel can't still be fogging my mind. She still felt that urge to return to her sitting room, though. It was not he. She had had to concentrate on getting out of the palace and reaching here. Once she would have gone to Alorian first, but Pelivar or Arathel would do. Once she had reasoned out how to explain away their exiles. Before she could open her mouth, Talonvor said, "It must be to Gareth Bryn. There is hard feeling against you among the great houses, my queen, but with Bryn following you, they will re-swear allegiance, if only because they know he will win every battle." She clamped her teeth shut to hold back instant refusal. Bryn was a traitor, but he was also one of the finest generals alive. His presence would be a convincing argument when she had to make Pelivar and the rest forget that she had exiled them. Very well. No doubt he would leap at the chance to be Captain General of the Queen's Guards once more. And if not, she would manage well enough without him. When the sun touched the horizon, they were 5 miles out of Camelin and riding hard for Core Springs.
Night was when Padan Fain felt most comfortable. As he padded through the tapestry-bedecked corridors of the White Tower, it seemed as though the darkness outside made a cloak to hide him from his enemies, despite the stand lamps, gilded and mirrored, burning along his way. A false feeling, he knew. His enemies were many and everywhere. Right that moment, as in every waking hour, he could feel Randall Thor. Not where he was, but that he was still alive. Somewhere. Still alive. It was a gift received at Shale Ghul, in the Pit of Doom, that awareness of Althor. His mind skittered away from memories of what had been done to him in the pit. He had been distilled there, remade. But later, in Aridhal, he had been reborn. Reborn to smite old enemies and new. He could feel something else as he stalked the empty night hallways of the tower. A thing that was his, stolen from him. A sharper desire drew him at this moment than his longing for Althor's death, or the tower's destruction, or even revenge against his ancient foe. A hunger to be whole. The heavy paneled door had thick hinges and iron straps, and a black iron lock set in it as big as his head. Few doors in the tower were ever locked. Who would dare steal in the midst of Aes Sedai? Yet some things the tower accounted too dangerous to be easily accessible. The most dangerous of all they kept behind this door, guarded by a stout lock. Giggling softly, he took 2 thin curved metal rods from his coat pocket, inserted them into the keyhole, probing and pressing, twisting. With a slow snap, the bolt came back. For a moment he sagged against the door, laughing hoarsely. Guarded by a stout lock, surrounded by Aes Sedai power, and guarded by simple metal. Even the servants and novices should be done with their chores at this hour, but someone still might be awake, might just wander by. Occasional ripples of mirth still shook him as he replaced the lockpicks in his pocket and took out a fat beeswax candle, lighting the wick at a nearby stand lamp. He held the candle high as he closed the door behind him, peering around. Shelves lined the wall, holding plain boxes and inlaid chests of various sizes and shapes. Small figures in bone or ivory or darker material. Things of
Hey,
metal and
17
glass
is Oil.
and
How you
crystal
doing?
that sparkled in the candlelight. Nothing that
Let's do
appeared
it, Dad.
dangerous. Dust covered everything.
It's kind of
Even the
it's a
eyes
mix.
that I
It's
came
a
here
little bit
seldom,
of
and they allowed no one else in.
ice
What he was
cream
seeking
cake, sugar
pulled
wax,
into it.
and then
On
a
a
little
waist-high
bit of
shelf stood a dark metal box. He opened
lemon
it,
pound
revealing
cake crumble.
flat walls 2 inches thick, with just enough space inside for a curved dagger in a golden sheath, a large ruby set in its hilt. Neither the gold nor the ruby, glittering dark as blood, interested him. Hastily, he spilled a little wax to hold the candle beside the box and snatched up the dagger. He sighed as soon as he touched it, stretched languorously. He was whole again, one with what had bound him so long ago, one with what, in a very real way, had given him life. Iron hinges creaked faintly, and he darted for the door, bearing the curved blade. The pale young woman opening the door had only time to gape, to try to leap back before he slashed her cheek. In the same motion, he dropped the sheath and seized her arm, jerked her past him into the storeroom. Putting his head out, he peered up and down the hallway. Still empty. He took his time about pulling his head back and shutting the door again. He knew what he would find. The young woman lay thrashing on the stone floor, trying and failing to scream. Her hands clawed at a face already black and bloated beyond recognition, the dark swelling oozing down onto her shoulders like thick oil. Her snowy skirts, banded in colors at the hem, flailed as her feet scrabbled uselessly. He licked at a splash of blood on his hand and giggled as he picked up the sheath. "You are a fool." He spun, dagger reaching, but the air around him seemed to turn solid, encasing him from his neck to the sole of his boots. He hung there, on the balls of his feet, dagger extended to stab, staring at Alviarin as she shut the door behind her and leaned against it to study him. There had been no creak this time. The soft scraping of the dying girl's slippers in the floor stones could never have masked it. He blinked away sweat that was suddenly stinging his eyes. "Did you really think," the Aes Sedai went on, "that there would be no guard on this room, no watch kept? A ward was set on that lock. That young fool's task tonight was to monitor it. Had she done as she was supposed to, you would find a dozen warders and as many Aes Sedai outside this door now. She is paying the price of her stupidity." The thrashing behind him stilled, and his eyes narrowed. Alviarin was not Yellow Aja, but even so, she could have made an attempt to heal the young woman. And she had not raised the alarm the Accepted should have either, or she would not now be here alone. "You are Black Aja," he whispered. "A dangerous accusation," she said calmly. It was not clear to which of them it was dangerous. Swan Sanche tried to claim the Black Aja was real when she was under the question. She begged to tell us of them. Elida would not hear it, and will not. Tales of the Black Aja are a vile slander against the tower. "You are Black Aja," he said in a louder voice. "You want to steal that?" She sounded as though he had not spoken. "The ruby is not worth it, Fane, or whatever your name is. That blade is tainted so none but a fool would touch it except with tongs, or be near it for a moment longer than necessary. You can see what it did to Vereen. So why did you come here, and go straight to what you should not have known was here? You cannot have had time for any search. I can dispose of Elida for you. One touch of this, and even healing will not save her." He tried to gesture with the dagger, but could not budge it a hair. If he could have moved it, Alviarin would be dead by now. You could be first in the tower. Cool, contemptuous. "Do you think I would? Second suits me. Little Ida claim credit for what she calls successes, and sweat for her failures, too. I know our lives. Now answer my questions, or 2 corpses will be found here in the morning instead of 1. There would be 2 in any case, whether he answered her with suitable lies or not. She did not mean to let him live. I have seen Thakandar. Saying that hurt. The memories it brought were agony. He refused to whimper, forced the words out. The great sea of fog, rolling and crashing in silence against the black cliffs, the fires of the forges glowing red beneath, and the lightning stabbing up into a sky fit to drive men mad. He did not want to go on, but he made himself. I have taken the path down to the belly of Shale Ghul, a long way with stones like fangs brushing my head, to the shore of a lake of fire and molten rock. No, not again. That holds the great Lord of the Dark in its endless depths. The heavens above Shale Ghul are black at noon with his breath. Alviarin was standing upright now, eyes wide. Not fearful, but impressed. I have heard of... She began softly, then shook herself and stared at him piercingly. Who are you? Why are you here? Did one of the Chosen send you? Why was I not informed? He threw back his head and laughed. Are the tasks given to the likes of me for the likes of you to be knowing? The accents of his native Lugard were strong again. In a way, it was his native city. Do the Chosen confide everything in you, then? Something inside seemed to shout that this was not the way, but he hated Aes Sedai, and that something inside him did too. Be careful, Aes Sedai, or they'll be giving you to a murderer for its sport. Her glare was icicles stabbing his eyes. We shall see, Master Fane. I will clear away this mess you have made, and then we shall see which of us stands higher with the Chosen. Eyeing the dagger, she backed from the room. The air around him did not soften until she had been gone a full minute. Silently, he snarled at himself. Fool, playing the Aes Sedai's game, groveling for them, and then one moment of anger to ruin all. Sheathing the dagger, he nicked himself and licked the wound before sticking the weapon under his coat. He was not at all what she thought. He had been a dark friend once, but he was beyond that now. Beyond it, above it. Something different. Something more. If she managed to communicate with one of the Forsaken before he could dispose of her, better not to try. No time to find the Horn of Alir now. There were followers awaiting him outside the city. They should still be waiting. He had put fear into them. He hoped some of the humans were still alive. Before the sun rose, he was out of the tower, off the island of Tarvalin. Althor was out there, somewhere, and he was whole again. Chapter 20. Jengai Pass. Under the looming spine of the world, Rand guided Jiotin up the stony slope from the foothills that began the foot of Jengai Pass. The dragon wall pierced the sky, dwarfing all other mountains, its snow-capped peaks defying the baking afternoon sun. The tallest thrust well above the clouds that mocked the waste with promises of rain that had never come. Rand could not imagine why a man would want to climb a mountain, but it was said that men who had tried to scale these heights turned back, overcome with fear and unable to breathe. He could well believe that a man might grow too afraid to breathe, attempting to climb so high. Yet though the Kyrianen are consumed with the game of houses, Moraine was saying at his shoulder, they will follow you so long as they know that you are strong. Be firm with them, but I would ask you to be fair also. A ruler who gives true justice. He tried to ignore her, as he did the other riders, and the creak and rumble of Kadir's wagons making heavy going further back. The broken gorges and gullies of the waste were behind them, but these rugged rising hills, nearly as barren, were little better for wagons. No one had traveled this path in over 20 years. Moraine talked at him that way from daybreak to sunset, whenever he let her. Her lectures could be on small things, details of court behavior, say, in Carrion or Saldaia or somewhere else, or on large, the political influence of the White Cloaks, or perhaps the effects of trade on rulers' decisions to go to war. It was as if she meant to see him educated, as a noble would be, or should be, before he reached the other side of the mountains. It was surprising how often what she said reflected what anyone back in Emmons Field would have called simple common sense, and also how often it did not. Occasionally she came out with something startling. For instance, that he should trust no woman of the Tower except herself, Egwene, Elaine, and Nynaeve, or the news that Elida was now the Amaranceat. Oath to obey or no, she would not tell him how she knew that. She said it was someone else's place to tell if she chose, someone else's secret, and she could not usurp it. He suspected the Wise One dreamwalkers, though they had stared him right in the eye and refused to say aye or nay. He wished he could make them swear Moraine's oath. They interfered between him and the chiefs continually, as if they wanted him to go through them to reach the chiefs. Right that minute, he did not want to think about Elida or the Wise Ones, or listen to Moraine. Now he wanted to study the pass ahead, a deep gap in the mountains that twisted as though a blunt axe had tried to chop through again and again, never quite succeeding. A few minutes' hard ride, and he could be in it. On one side of the pass mouth, a sheer cliff had been smoothed over 100-pace width and carved, a wind-weathered snake entwining a staff a good 300 spans high. Monument or marker or ruler's sigil, it surely dated from some lost nation before Arthur Hawkwing, perhaps even before the Trolloc Wars. He had seen remnants before from nations long vanished. Often even Moraine did not know their source. High on the other side, so far up that he was not sure he was seeing what he thought, just below the snow line, stood something even stranger. Something that made the first monument of a few thousand years a commonplace. He could have sworn it was the remnants of shattered buildings, shining gray against the darker mountain. And stranger still, what appeared to be a dock of the same material as for ships, slanting drunkenly down the mountain. If he was not imagining it, that had to date from before the breaking. The face of the world had been changed utterly in those years. This could well have been an ocean's floor before. He would have to ask Asmodean. Even if he had had the time, he did not think he would want to try reaching that altitude to find out for himself. At the foot of the huge snake lay Tyen, a high-walled town of moderate size, a remnant itself of the time when Cairhien had been allowed to send caravans across the threefold land, and wealth had flowed from Shara along the Silk Path. There appeared to be birds above the town, and dark blotches at regular intervals along the gray stone walls. Matt stood in Pips's stirrups, shading his eyes with that broad-brimmed hat to peer up the pass, frowning. Lan's hard face wore no expression at all, yet he appeared just as intent. A gust of wind, a little cooler here, whipped his color-shifting cloak around him, and for a moment all of him from shoulders to boots seemed to blend into the rocky hills and sparse thorn bushes. "Are you listening to me?" Moraine said suddenly, reining her white mare closer. "You must—" She took a deep breath. "Please, Rand. There is so much that I must tell you, so much that you need to know." The hint of pleading in her tone made him glance at her. He could remember when he had been overawed by her presence. Now she seemed quite small, for all her regal manner. A fool thing that he should feel protective of her. "There is plenty of time ahead of us, Moraine," he said gently. "I don't pretend to think I know as much of the world as you. I mean to keep you close from now on." He barely realized how great a change that was from when she was keeping him close. But I have something else on my mind right now. Of course, she sighed. As you wish. We have plenty of time yet. Rand heeled the dappled gray stallion to a trot, and the others followed. The wagons quickened too, though they could not keep up on the slope. Osmodian's, Jason Tails, patch-covered gleeman's cloak rippled behind him like the banner he carried at his stirrup. Brilliant red, with the white and black symbol of the ancient Aes Sedai at its center. His face wore a sullen glower. He had not been best pleased at having to be the bannerman. Under that sign he would conquer, the prophecy of Roydion said. And perhaps it would not frighten the world so much as the dragon banner, Luz Theron's banner, that he had left flying over the Stone of Tyr. Few would know this sign. The blotches on the walls of Tyon were bodies, contorted in their final agonies, bloated in the sun and hanging by their necks in a row that seemed to encircle the town. The birds were glossy black ravens and vultures with their heads and necks befouled. Some ravens perched on corpses, gorging, unconcerned for the new arrivals. The sickly sweet stench of corruption hung in the dry air, and the acrid smell of char. Iron-strapped gates stood gaping open on an expanse of ruin, soot-streaked stone houses and collapsed roofs. Nothing moved except the birds. Like Maruwa. He tried to shake the thought away, but in his head he could see that great city after it was retaken. Immense towers blackened and collapsing, the remains of great bonfires at every street crossing, where those who had refused to swear to the shadow had been bound and thrown alive to the flames. He knew whose memory it had to be, though he had not discussed it with Moraine. I am Randall Thor. Luz Theron Telemann is dead 3,000 years. I am myself. That was one battle he meant to win. If he did have to die at Shale Ghul, he would die as himself. He made himself think of something else. Half a month since he had left Rudion. Half a month, though the Aiel had set a pace afoot from sunup to sundown that wearied the horses. But Couladin had been moving this way a week before he learned of it. If they had not managed to close any ground, he would have that long to ravage Cairhien before Rand could reach it. Longer, before the Shydale could be brought to bay. Not a much happier thought. There's someone watching us from those rocks to the left, Lan said quietly. He seemed to be completely engrossed in studying what remained of Tyon. Not Aiel, or I doubt I would have seen a glimmer. Rand was glad that he had made Egwene and Aviendha stay with the Wise Ones. The town gave him a new reason, but the Watcher fit in with his original plan, when he had hoped that Tyon had escaped. Egwene still wore the same Aiel clothes as Aviendha, and Aiel would not have been very welcome in Tyon. They were even less likely to be welcome among the survivors. He looked back at the wagons drawing to a halt a short distance downslope. Mutters drifted up from the drivers, now that they could see the town clearly, and the wall's decorations. Kadir, his bulk all in white again today, mopped at his hawk-nosed face with a large kerchief. He appeared unperturbed, merely pursing his lips thoughtfully. Rand expected that Moraine would have to find new drivers once they were through the pass. Kadir and his crew would likely flee as soon as they had the chance. And he would have to let them go. It was not right. It was not justice. But it was necessary to protect Osmodian. How long now had he been doing what was necessary instead of what was right? In a fair world, they would be one and the same. That made him laugh, a hoarse wheeze. He was far from the village boy he had been, but sometimes that boy sneaked up on him. The others looked at him, and he fought the urge to tell them that he was not mad yet. Long minutes passed before two coatless men and a woman emerged from the rocks, all three ragged and dirty and barefoot. They approached hesitantly, heads tilted uneasily, eyes darting from rider to the wagons and back, as though they might take flight at a shout. Gaunt cheeks and wavering steps spoke of hunger. "Thank the light," one of the men said finally. He was gray-haired. None of the three was young. His face deeply creased. His eyes lingered a moment on Osmodian, with falls of lace at collar and cuffs, but the leader of this train would not be riding a mule and carrying a banner. It was Rand's stirrup that he clutched anxiously. "Allah be praised that you came out of those terrible lands alive, my lord." That might have been Rand's blue silk coat embroidered in gold on the shoulders, or the banner, or simple flattery. The man certainly had no reason to think them other than merchants, if well dressed for it. "Those murdering savages have risen again. It is another IU war. They were over the wall in the night before anybody knew, killing everyone who raised a hand, stealing everything not mortared in place." "In the night," Matt said sharply. Hat pulled low, he was still studying the ruined town. "Were your sentries asleep? You did have sentries this close to your enemies. Even IU would have a hard time coming at you if you kept a good watch." Land gave him an appraising look. "No, my lord." The gray-haired man blinked at Matt, then gave his answer to Rand. Matt's green coat was fine enough for a lord, but it hung open and looked slept in. We had only a watchman at each gate. It has been long since any have even seen one of the savages. This time, whatever they did not steal, they burned, and drove us out to starve. Filthy animals! Thank the light you have come to save us, my lord, or we would all have died here. I am Talnethan. I was a saddle maker. A good one, my lord. This is my sister Aril, and her husband, Under Coral. He makes fine boots." "They stole people too, my lord," the woman said, her voice raw. Somewhat younger than her brother, she might have been handsome once, but haggard worry had etched lines in her face that Rand suspected would never entirely go away. Her husband had a lost look in his eyes, as if not exactly sure where he was. "My daughter, my lord, and my son. They took all the young ones, everyone above 16, and some twice that or more. Said they were Guy something, and stripped them naked right in the street and herded them off. My lord, can you?" She trailed off, eyes squeezing shut as the impossibility overwhelmed her, swaying. Small odds that she would ever see her children again. Moraine was out of her saddle in an instant, and by Aril's side. The haggard woman gave a loud gasp as soon as the Aes Sedai's hands touched her, shivering to her toe tips. Her wondering look turned to Moraine questioningly, but Moraine only held her as if supporting her. The woman's husband suddenly gaped, staring at Rand's gilded belt buckle, the gift from Avienda. "His arms were marked like that, all twined around, like the cliff snake."
The speaker went dead. Turn my other one off. At least this one's fully charged.
"Had markings like that on his arms. He wore those strange clothes they all do, but he had his coat sleeves cut off, and he made sure everybody saw." "A gift I received in the waist," Rand said. He made sure to keep his hands still on his pommel. His coat sleeves hid his own dragons, except for the heads. They would be visible on the backs of his hands to anyone who looked closely. Aril had forgotten about wondering what Moraine had actually done, and all three looked on the point of running. "How long since they left?" 6 days, my lord," Tal said uneasily. "They did what they did in a night and a day, and were gone the next. We would have gone too, but what if we met them coming back? Surely they would turn back at Selene?" That was the town at the other end of the pass. Rand doubted that Selene was in any better condition than Tyan by this time. "How many survivors are there besides you three?" "Maybe 100, my lord. Maybe more. Nobody is counted." Abruptly, anger flared in him, though he tried to hold it down. 100 of you. His voice was icy iron. "And 6 days. Then why are your dead left for the ravens? Why do corpses still decorate your town walls?" Those are your people, filling your nostrils with their stink. Huddling together, the three backed away from his horse. We were afraid, my lord, Tal said hoarsely. They went, but they could come back. And he told us, the one with the markings on his arms, told us not to touch anything. A message, Ender said in a dull voice. He chose them out to hang, just pulling them out until he had enough to line the wall. Men, women, he did not care. His eyes were fixed on Rand's buckle. He said they were a message for some man who would be following him. He said he wanted this man to know what they were going to do on the other side of the spine. He said he would do worse to this man. Arul's eyes widened suddenly, and the three stared beyond Rand for a moment, gaping. Then, screaming, they turned and ran. Black-veiled Aiel rose from the rocks they had come from, and they darted off in another direction. The veiled Aiel appeared there, too, and they collapsed to the ground, sobbing and holding each other as they were surrounded. Moraine's face was cool and composed, but her eyes were not serene. Rand twisted in his saddle. Ruark and Derek were coming up the slope, unveiling themselves and unwrapping the shufa from around their heads. Derek was thicker than Ruark, with a prominent nose and paler streaks through his golden hair. He had brought the rain Aiel, as Ruark said he would. Timolin and his Mia Goma had been paralleling them to the north for 3 days, exchanging occasional messengers, but giving no clue to his intentions. The Kadara and the Shianda and the Daran were still somewhere to the east. Following, so Mies and the others said, from dream-talking to their wise ones, but slowly. Those wise ones had no more idea of their clan chief's aims than Rand did of Timolin's. Was that necessary? He said as the two chiefs came up to him. He had frightened the people first, but for cause, and had not made them think that they were going to die. Ruark simply shrugged, and Derek said, We put spears in place around this hold unseen as you wished. And there seemed no reason to wait, since no one remained here to dance spears. Besides, they are only tree killers. Rand drew a deep breath. He had known this might be as large a problem as Couladin in its own way. Nearly 500 years ago, the Aiel had presented Cairhien with a sapling, a cutting from Avendesora, and with it, a right granted to no other nation, to trade across the threefold land to Shara. They had given no reason. They did not like wetlanders very much at the best. But to the Aiel, it had been required by Jieto. During the long years of journey that had brought them to the waste, only one people had not attacked them. Only one had allowed them water uncontested when the world grew parched. And finally they had found the descendants of those people, the Cairhienin. For 500 years, riches had flowed into Cairhien with the silk and the ivory. 500 years, and Avendor Aldera grew in Cairhien. And then King Laemon had cut the tree down to make a throne. The nations knew why the Aiel had crossed the spine of the world 20 years ago. Laemon's sin, they called it, and Laemon's pride. But few knew that to the Aiel, it had not been a war. 4 clans had come to find an oath-breaker, and when they had killed him, they returned to the threefold land. But their contempt for the tree killers, the oath-breakers, had never died. Moraine being Aes Sedai offset her being Cairhienin, but Rand was never sure how much. These folk broke no oaths, he told them. Find the others. The Saddlemaker says there are about 100, and be gentle with them. If any of them were watching, they're probably running away into the mountains by now. The two Aiel started to turn away, and he added, Do you hear what they told me? What do you think of what Couladin did here? They killed more than they had to, Derek said with a disgusted shake of his head. Like black ferrets falling on rock hens' nests in a gully. Killing was as easy as dying, so the Aiel said. Any fool could do either. And the other thing, taking prisoners, Gaishain? Ruark and Derek exchanged looks, and Derek's mouth tightened. Clearly they had heard, and it made them uncomfortable. It took a great deal to make an Aiel uncomfortable. "It cannot be so," Ruark said at last. "If it is, Gaishain is a thing of Jieto. No one can be made Gaishain who does not follow Jieto, else they are only human animals, such as the Sharans keep. Culloden has abandoned Jieto." Derek sounded as though he were saying stones had grown wings. Matt guided Pips closer, using his knees. He had never been more than an indifferent rider, but sometimes, when he was thinking of something else, he rode as though born on a horse's back. "That surprises you," he said. "After everything he has done already, the man would cheat at dice with his mother." They gave him flat-eyed stares, like blue stones. In many ways, Aiel were Jieto. And whatever else Culloden was, he was still Aiel in their eyes. Sept before clan, clan before outsiders, but Aiel before wetlanders. Some of the maidens joined them, Anila and Jolene and Adeline, and wiry white-haired Sulin, who had been chosen room mistress of the Roof of the Maidens in Rudion. She had told the maidens who stayed to choose another, and now she led the maidens here. They sensed the mood and said nothing, only grounded their spear points patiently. An Aiel who wanted to could make the rocks look hasty. Lan broke the silence. "If Culloden expects you to be following him, he may have left a surprise somewhere in the pass. 100 men could hold some of those narrows against an army. 1,000? "We will camp here then," Rand said, "and send scouts ahead to make sure the way is clear." "Duwada Madiin?" "Water seekers," Derek agreed, sounding pleased. That had been his society before he became clan chief. Sulin and the other maidens gave Rand flat stares as the Rain Chief walked away downslope. He had chosen scouts from other societies for the last 3 days when he had begun to fear what he might find here. And he had the feeling they knew he was not just giving the others their turns. He tried to ignore their looks. Sulin's was especially difficult. The woman could have driven nails with those pale blue eyes. "Ruark, once the survivors are found, see that they're fed and well treated. We will take them with us." His gaze was drawn to the town wall. Some Aiel were already using their curved horn bows to kill ravens. Sometimes Shadowspawn used ravens and other animals that fed on death as spies. Shadow eyes, the Aiel called them. These barely paused in the frenzied feeding until they fell transfixed with an arrow. But a wise man did not take chances with ravens or rats. "And see that the dead are buried. At least in that, right and necessity were the same." Chapter 21. The Gift of a Blade. The camp began to go up quickly in the mouth of Jengai Pass, away from Tyan, and spreading over the hills around the approaches, and among the scattered thorn bushes, and even onto the slopes of the mountains. Not that anything was very visible except what was inside the pass. Aiel tents blended into the stony soil so well that you could miss them even when you knew what you were looking for and where. In the hills, the Aiel camped by clan, but those in the pass itself grouped themselves by society. They were mostly maidens, but the men's societies sent their representatives too, some 50 each, spreading tents well above the ruins of Dian in slightly separated camps. Everyone understood, or thought they did, about the maidens carrying Rand's honor, but all societies wanted to guard the Karakan. Moiraine, and Lan of course, went to get Kadir's wagons settled just below the town. I fussed over what was in those wagons nearly as much as she did over Rand. The drivers muttered and cursed about the town's smell and avoided watching the Aiel cut bodies down from the wall. But after their months in the waste, they seemed to like being close even to the wreckage of what they saw as civilization. Gaishain were wrecking the Wise Ones' tents, those of Amis and Bear and Mullane, below the town, astride the fated track that led up out of the hills. Rand was sure they would say they had chosen the spot to be available to him, as well as to the countless dozens of Wise Ones below, but he thought it no coincidence that anyone coming up from the hills to him would have to go through or around their camp to reach him. He was a little surprised to see Melaine directing the white-robed figures. Only 3 nights before, she had married Bale in a ceremony that made her his wife and first sister to his other wife, Dorinda. That part had been just as important as the marriage, apparently. Avienda had been shocked at his surprise, or maybe angry. When Egwene arrived with Avienda up behind her on the gray mare, those full skirts pushed above their knees, they looked a matched pair despite their different coloring, and Avienda being tall enough to look over Egwene's shoulder without stretching, each with just one ivory bracelet and one necklace. The work of removing the hanged corpses had barely begun. Most of the ravens lay dead, bundles of black feathers littering the ground, and the rest had flown. But vultures, too gorged to flap aloft, still waddled through the ashes inside the walls. Rand wished that there was some way he could keep the 2 women from having to see, but to his surprise, neither went running to empty her stomach. Well, he had not really expected anything of the sort from Avienda. She had seen death often enough, and dealt it out, too, and her face remained expressionless. But he had not expected the pure pity in Egwene's eyes as she gazed at the bloated dead coming down. She drew Mist over to Jotun and leaned to put a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Rand. There was no way you could have stopped this." "I know," he told her. He had not even known there was a town here until Ruark mentioned it casually 5 days ago. His councils with the chiefs had all been on whether they could cover more ground in a day, and what Couladin would do when he cleared the Jangai. And by that time, the Shido had finished here and gone. He had done with cursing himself for a fool then. "Well, just you remember it. It was not your fault." She heeled Mist on and began talking to Avienda before she was out of earshot. "I'm glad he is taking it so well. He has the habit of feeling guilty over things he cannot control." "Men always believe they are in control of everything around them," Avienda replied. "When they find out they are not, they think they have failed, instead of learning a simple truth women already know." Egwene giggled. "That is the simple truth. Once I saw those poor people, I thought he was heaving somewhere." "Is his stomach so tender? Their voices faded away as the mare ambled on. Rand pulled himself back upright in the saddle, flushing. Trying to eavesdrop on them. He was behaving like an idiot. That did not stop him frowning at their departing backs. He only took responsibility for what he was accountable for, if only to himself. Just for things he could do something about. And what he should have done something about. He did not like them talking about him, behind his back or under his nose. The light only knew what they were saying. Dismounting, he led Jotun in search of Osmodian, who seemed to have wandered off. After so many days in the saddle, it was good to walk. Various clusters of tents were springing up along the pass. The mountain slopes and cliffs made formidable barriers, but the Aiel still arranged themselves as if they could expect attack from them. He had tried walking with the Aiel, but half a day was enough to put him back on the horse. It was hard enough to keep up with them mounted. They could wear out horses when they pressed. Matt was down too, squatting with his reins in one hand and that black-hafted spear across his knees, peering at the gaping gates, studying the town and muttering to himself while Pips tried to nibble at a thorn bush. Matt was studying, not just staring. Where had that remark about sentries come from? Matt said odd things at times now, since their first visit to Rudian. Rand wished that he were willing to talk about what had happened, but he still denied that anything had, despite the fox-head medallion, the spear, and that scar around his neck. Melindra, the Shido maiden that Matt had taken up with, was off to one side, watching Matt, until Sulan came and chased her away on some errand. Rand wondered if Matt knew the maidens were laying bets on whether Melindra would give up the spear for him, and on whether she would teach him to sing, too, though they only laughed when Rand asked what that meant. The sound of music drew him to Osmodian, seated by himself on a granite outcrop with his harp on his knee. The crimson banner's staff had been twisted into the rocky soil, and the mule tethered to it. "You see, my Lord Dragon," he said cheerfully, "your bannerman keeps loyally to his duties." His voice and expression changed, and he said, "If you must have this thing, why not let Matt carry it, or Lan, or Moraine, for that matter? She would be glad to carry your banner and clean your boots. Be careful of her. She is a devious woman. When a woman says she will obey you of her own will, it is time to sleep lightly and watch your back. You carry it because you were chosen, Master Jason Mateo." Osmodian gave a start and looked around, though everyone else was too far away and too busy to be listening. None but they two would have understood anyway. "What do you know about those ruins up near the snow line? They must come from the Age of Legends." Osmodian did not even glance up the mountain. "This world is very changed from the world I went to sleep in." He sounded weary, and he shivered slightly. "What I know of what lies where, I have learned since waking." The mournful sounds of the March of Death rose from his harp. "That could be what is left of the city where I was born, for all I know. Shorel was a port." The sun had maybe an hour before the spine of the world hit it. This close to high mountains, night came early. "I am too tired for one of our discussions tonight." That was what they called Osmodian's lessons in public, even when no one was around. Added to practice sessions with Lan O'Ruarc, those lessons had left him little time for sleep since leaving Rudion. "You take to your tent when you're ready, and I'll see you in the morning, with the banner." There was no one else to carry the bloody thing. Maybe he could find somebody in Cairhien. As he was turning away, Asmodian plucked something discordant and said, "No burning nets woven around my tent tonight. Do you finally begin to trust me?" Rand looked back over his shoulder. "I trust you like a brother, until the day you betray me. You have a parole for what you've done, in return for your teaching, and a better bargain than you deserve. But the day you turn against me, I will tear it up and bury it with you." Osmodian opened his mouth, but Rand forestalled him. "That is me talking the tale. Randolph Thor. Two Rivers folk don't like people who try to stab them in the back." Irritably, he pulled at the Dapple's reins and went on before the other man could say anything. He was not sure whether Osmodian had any inkling that a dead man was trying to take him over, but he should not have let himself give the man hints. Osmodian was sure enough already that he was a helpless cause, if he began to think that Rand was not in full control of his own mind. Perhaps that he was going mad? The Forsaken would abandon him in a heartbeat, and there was too much Rand had to learn yet. White-robed Guy Shine were erecting his tent under Avienda's direction, well into the pass mouth, with that huge carved snake rearing above. The Guy Shine had their own tents, but those would be the last erected, of course. Adeline and a dozen or so maidens squatted nearby, watching, waiting to guard his sleep. Even with over 1,000 maidens encamped around him every night, they still put a guard on his tent. Before approaching, he reached out through the Angreal in his coat pocket to see Saidin. There was no need to actually touch the carving of the fat little man with a sword, of course. Mingled filth and sweetness filled him, that raging river of fire, that crushing avalanche of ice. Channeling as he had done every night since leaving Rudion, he set wards around the entire encampment, not only what was in the pass, but every tent in the hills below as well, and on the slopes of the mountains. He needed the Angreal to set warding so large, but only just. He had thought that he was strong before, but Asmodian's teaching were making him stronger. No human or animal crossing the line of that ward would notice anything, but shadow spawn that touched it would sound a warning that everyone in the tents would hear. Had he done this in Rudion, the Darkhounds could never have entered without him knowing. The Aiel themselves would have to keep watch for human enemies. Wardings were complex weaves, if tenuous, and trying to make them do more than one thing could render them useless in practicality. He could have made this one to kill Shadowspawn instead of merely giving warning, but that would have been like a beacon to any male Forsaken who might be searching, and to Myrddraal too. No need to bring his enemies down on him when they might not know where he was. This, even one of the Forsaken would not know until he was close, and to Myrddraal, not until it was too late. Letting go of Saidin was an exercise in self-control, despite the foulness of the taint, despite the way the power tried to scour him away like sand on a riverbed, to burn him, obliterate him. He floated in the vast emptiness of the void, yet he could feel the air stirring against each hair on his head, see the weave of the Gaishan's robes, smell Avienda's warm scent. He wanted more. But he could smell the ashes of...
All right, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.